So, how many times have you read about a battle that seemed too dull to even bother finishing? In the rich tapestry of human history, there are stories that stand out like brightly colored threads, gripping tales of valiant heroes and nail-biting victory. Then there are the moments that seem like faded gray threads, blending into the background and almost disappearing from sight. Battles like these are often overlooked when recounting historical texts. They don't roll off the tongue like the Battle of Hastings or the clash at Thermopylae. And yet, when we pull back the curtain of time, we realize that these so-called boring battles weren't just filler chapters in history's grand narrative. They were foundational moments that shaped the world we inhabit today. These battles were the quiet architects of change, laying the groundwork for empires, shaping political alliances, and influencing societal norms. Without them, the world map could look vastly different, and our lives would undoubtedly be less colorful. In this journey through time, we will revisit some of these forgotten clashes. We'll explore why they were anything but ordinary and uncover the profound impact they had on the course of history. Let's go! Before we start, click the like button because it really helps us grow. Also, subscribe to never miss any new videos. The first battle that fits this description is the Battle of Corinth. You probably haven't heard of it, but trust me, it was significant. On October 27, 1944, near Corinth in Romania, Soviet troops faced off against German forces in what turned out to be one of the weirdest battles of World War II. It wasn't just the sheer oddness of the situation that made it stand out, but also its historical impact. The battle started as a routine military operation with German forces attempting to stop the advancing Soviets. But then something unexpected happened. A group of Romanian soldiers who were part of the German forces opened fire on their own comrades. This led to a lot of confusion and casualties on the German side. Now, why did these Romanian soldiers do this? Well, they weren't happy about fighting for Germany. And let's face it, who would be after finding out that their country had been invaded by an Axis power? Rumor had it that the Romanian officers were planning to surrender to the Soviets, which caused the Germans to panic. Things got really chaotic and the situation spiraled out of control. As the fighting intensified, the chaos on the battlefield became a sight to behold. German troops were caught off guard by the sudden turn of events. Imagine being a German soldier in the middle of this bizarre melee, unsure of who to trust and caught in a crowd. It was pure bedlam. The battle ended with a surprising amount of casualties on the German side and only a small number of prisoners taken by the Soviets. Some accounts even suggest that the actual number of German dead was much higher than official reports stated. Picture this. Thousands of German troops either lying dead on the ground or hiding for their dear lives amidst this confusing turn of events. Now, it's important to remember that this wasn't a grand battle like others we've heard about. But that's precisely why it's so remarkable. Battles like these played a crucial role in the broader historical narrative, paving the way for significant changes that wouldn't have been possible without this confusing clash. The next one is the Battle of On October 3rd, 1569, two powerful French factions clashed near the village of Moncontour in what turned out to be a significant but often overlooked battle. The conflict was part of the French Wars of Religion, a series of brutal and divisive civil wars that tore France apart during the 16th century. The Huguenots, French Protestants who followed the teachings of John Calvin, were locked in a struggle for power and religious freedom against the Catholic League, a coalition of French Catholics determined to suppress the Protestant Reformation. The Battle of Moncontour pitted the Huguenots led by the charismatic Prince of Condé against the forces of the Catholic League commanded by the Duke of Guise. Despite the personal rivalries and deep-rooted religious differences, the battle itself was not particularly noteworthy. It lacked the epic scale and dramatic flair of other medieval clashes. There were no legendary knights or inspiring displays of martial prowess. Instead, it was a relatively small and uneventful affair compared to other battles of the time. Yet, It held immense historical significance. Moncontour marked a turning point in the French Wars of Religion. It demonstrated that neither side could claim a decisive victory and led to a fragile peace that allowed France to begin the process of healing its deep religious divisions. This wasn't the end of the conflicts, but it was a necessary step towards eventual reconciliation. Imagine the tension and uncertainty hanging heavy in the air after the battle. The outcome was far from the glorious victory that both sides had hoped for, but it set the stage for important conversations and compromises that would help shape France's future. The third one is the Battle of Changchun. In December 1950, amidst the frozen landscapes of North Korea, a battle unfolded that would become a defining moment of the Korean War, yet remained largely unknown to most people. This battle, fought between Chinese and American forces, was a turning point in the war, marking the end of any hopes for a swift and decisive victory by the United Nations command. The battle began when Chinese troops launched a surprise attack, overwhelming the underprepared UN forces. As the fighting raged, the Chinese troops displayed remarkable resilience and fighting spirit. They charged through the freezing cold, engaging the enemy with fierce determination. The battle took a brutal turn when the UN forces regrouped and counterattacked. Intense hand-to-hand combat ensued, leaving both sides with heavy casualties. The Chinese, despite being outnumbered and outgunned, refused to back down. Eventually, the UN command ordered a retreat, marking the end of the battle. The significance of the Battle of Changchun cannot be overstated. It shattered any remaining illusions of the Chinese People's Volunteer Army being a disorganized and inferior force. The battle showcased the strength and tenacity of the Chinese troops, forcing the UN command to reassess their strategies. It marked a shift in the war and ultimately contributed to the prolonged stalemate that led to the armistice in 1953. This was a battle that reshaped perceptions and left an enduring legacy on the Korea Peninsula. Now, each of these battles might not have been a cinematic spectacle, but their ripple effects were undeniable. They altered the course of history in ways that few could have predicted. From the muddy trenches of World War II to the icy landscapes of the Korean War, these battles remind us that history isn't always as clear-cut as it seems. They demonstrate that sometimes the quietest moments in history can lead to the loudest outcome. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, please subscribe to be notified when we release new videos. Your engagement helps us continue creating exciting content that brings history to life. Thank you for watching.
This series explores the stories of ordinary people caught up in extraordinary events. Today we are transported back to a misty morning in October 1917 when hundreds of men began to trudge across no man's land. Their destination, a network of trenches that snaked through the rolling hills of Belgium. This wasn't your typical military operation. No bugles blared, no drums pounded, and there was no thunderous roar of cannons shaking the ground. As these men moved forward, the only sound was the crunch of their boots on the muddy earth and the low murmur of their voices. What they lacked in fanfare, however, they made up for in numbers. Led by the British Army's Lieutenant General Sir Herbert Plumer, this force comprised nearly 20,000 soldiers, many of them seasoned veterans of the Great War. Among them were troops from South Africa, New Zealand, and the United Kingdom. The men were part of the British Empire, an alliance bound together by duty, camaraderie, and a shared identity under the Crown. Yet, despite this unity, each soldier harbored his own hopes and fears, dreams and regrets. For some, the upcoming battle was just another day at the office. For others, it was a chance to prove themselves. And for many, it was a dreaded affair they wished they could forget. Their target, the infamous better known as the Third Battle of Ypres, was a formidable fortress constructed by the Germans. Hidden within its labyrinthine passages were a significant number of enemy soldiers, ready to defend their position to the last breath. With orders to capture the German trenches at all costs, the men prepared for action. They had been trained for this moment. Every step, every movement was a testament to their rigorous preparation. But as they closed in on the enemy lines, a heavy silence fell. The absence of cheers or battle cries underscored the gravity of their task. This was war in its rawest form, a test of endurance, discipline, and sheer willpower. As the first rays of dawn illuminated the muddy landscape, the men launched their attack. The sight that greeted them was both grim and surreal. Barbed wire fences, torn and tattered, stretched out before them like a macabre welcome mat. The once proud structure was now a symbol of the brutality that lay ahead. But the soldiers pressed on, their faces grim, their eyes focused on the prize. Slowly, methodically, they began to dismantle the fence, creating a path toward their objective. Each strand severed brought them one step closer to the enemy, one step closer to the heart of the conflict. Hours turned into days, and still the soldiers toiled, their progress measured in inches rather than yards. The stalemate was palpable, the tension mounting with each passing moment. The wind whispered through the barren trees, carrying with it the stench of decay and the distant rumble of artillery fire. As the men fought to breach the German defenses, the landscape around them transformed into a watery grave. Rain fell in torrents, turning the battlefield into a sea of mud. The soldiers, once proud and resolute, were now weary and disillusioned. But they held their ground, their determination fueled by duty and the hope of a swift resolution. On October, after 7 long days of relentless assault, the British finally breached the German lines. But instead of the triumphant cheers one might expect, there was a stunned silence, broken only by the sound of dripping water and the soft sobs of the wounded. What they found inside the captured trenches was not the enemy they had come to fight, but rows upon rows of empty rifles, abandoned helmets, and the haunting remnants of hastily abandoned camps. The soldiers had vanished, leaving behind only echoes of their presence. The realization dawned on the British that they had just spent a week fighting a phantom, a specter conjured by the fog of war. In the aftermath, questions swirled. Where had the Germans gone? Why had they abandoned their positions? And most importantly, what did this mean for the war? The silence of the empty trenches was deafening, a stark reminder of the elusive nature of victory. The battle, if it could be called that, became a defining moment in the war, a testament to the confusion, loss, and ultimately, the futility of war. The missing Germans were soon found, having retreated to new, cleverly concealed positions. Faced with such tenacity, the British High Command realized that capturing Passchendaele would be no easy feat, and so the attack continued, this time with even greater force. But the question remained, was this meticulously planned offensive worth the staggering cost in lives and resources? The answer, lost in the muddy annals of history. By October, as the full scale of the disaster unfolded, it became clear that the true cost of Passchendaele was not measured in territory gained or weapons seized. It was measured in the shattered lives of those who had fought and died in the pursuit of a victory that seemed increasingly elusive. Amidst the chaos and carnage, amidst the mud and the blood, the story of Passchendaele unfolded. It was a story of courage and sacrifice. Yes, but also one of missed opportunities and miscalculations. The battle, in its essence, was a human tragedy, a testament to the folly of war and the enduring spirit of those who fought in it. The legacy of Passchendaele serves as a stark reminder of the human cost of conflict, a somber tribute to those whose stories might never be fully told, but should never be forgotten. But why does the story of Passchendaele matter? What can we learn from this seemingly insignificant battle? First, Passchendaele offers a microcosm of World War I, a war defined by trench warfare, attrition, and technological advancements. The battle's failure to achieve its strategic objectives mirrors the larger war aims of the time. It reflects the limitations of military planning in an era when new technologies like poison gas and machine guns dramatically increased the cost of human life. Second, Passchendaele challenges the traditional narratives of war. We tend to remember battles for their decisive moments, for the turning points that shift the tide of conflict. But Passchendaele was a stalemate, a deadlock that achieved nothing. It forces us to confront the reality of war, not as a series of glorious engagements, but as a grinding, often pointless struggle. Third, the battle raises profound ethical questions about leadership and accountability. The decision to launch the attack was driven by military objectives and political pressures. The human cost, the loss of life and the physical and psychological trauma endured by the soldiers, was all too often overlooked. Passchendaele compels us to examine the ethics of leadership, the responsibility to protect, and the consequences of unchecked ambition. Finally, Passchendaele is a powerful reminder of the human cost of war. It's a story of individuals caught in a web of circumstance, of soldiers whose lives were irrevocably altered by the horrors they witnessed and experienced. The battle serves as a somber reminder of the need for remembrance, of the duty to honor those who served and sacrificed on the battlefields of Passchendaele. Because it's not just a tale of a forgotten battle. It's a reflection on the nature of war, the cost of conflict, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. It's a call to remember, to learn, and to strive for a world where such tragedies are never repeated. Now it's time to hear from you. What do you think? What insights or experiences can you bring to this discussion? Share your thoughts below. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to show your support. Your engagement helps us continue sharing these stories. Thanks for watching. There's been quite a few epic battles throughout history, but some of them are a bit less epic than others. These so-called boring battles are clashes that might make you wonder if the accounts are accurate, or if maybe someone got their historical periods mixed up. Yet despite their seemingly uneventful nature, these battles often had surprisingly significant impacts on the course of history. The term boring battle is used to describe a clash between two or more parties with the intention of showing how it lacks any excitement or dramatic flair. However, there's much more to these battles than meets the eye. Many of these clashes played pivotal roles in shaping the outcomes of entire wars, or even determining the fate of nations. So let's dive into some of the most noteworthy examples. We begin our journey through the realm of surprisingly significant boring battles with the Siege of Gibraltar in 1704. A small fortified piece of the Iberian Peninsula found itself under siege by French and Spanish forces during the War of the Spanish Succession. While it might not sound like the stuff of legends, what unfolded over the next 3 years was a testament to human tenacity and strategic brilliance. The siege was notable for its prolonged duration and the formidable defenses put up by the British garrison. Despite facing constant bombardment and persistent attacks, the garrison held their ground. What made this siege truly remarkable was the unexpected role it played in the overall war. At the time, the conflict was largely seen as a struggle between Spain and Britain. However, the prolonged stalemate in Gibraltar forced the French to divert resources away from other theaters of war to sustain the siege effort. This diversion of resources ultimately weakened the French position elsewhere, contributing to their inability to achieve decisive victories in other areas. As the siege dragged on, the defenders' tenacity and the attackers' mounting casualties began to shift the perception of the war. The siege became a symbol of British resilience and the futility of Franco-Spanish ambitions. Eventually, the attackers were forced to lift the siege, allowing the defenders to emerge victorious after enduring unimaginable hardships. The successful defense of Gibraltar not only preserved the strategic importance of the fortress, but also had broader implications for the war. It highlighted the strengths of the British military and the limitations of Franco-Spanish cooperation, thus shaping the outcome of the conflict. Fast forward to 1796, when the Anglo-Dutch took on the Danish in the Battle of the Dogger Bank. This naval engagement might not have been the most thrilling sea battle, but it proved to be a turning point in the war between the coalition forces led by Britain and the Danish-Norwegian fleet. Now you might be thinking, why is a battle that doesn't sound very exciting considered important? Well, let me tell you. The significance of the Battle of the Dogger Bank lies not in its action-packed narrative, but in its strategic implications. You see, at the start of the war, Denmark and Norway had sided with France and were causing trouble for the British, but the British were desperate to break free from the costly stalemate. Enter the battle. Even though it wasn't exactly a nail-biting encounter, the Anglo-Dutch fleet managed to inflict a decisive defeat on the Danish-Norwegian forces. This victory opened up new possibilities for the coalition, giving them the freedom to disrupt Danish shipping and trade routes. In fact, this maneuver had far-reaching effects. It cut off vital supplies heading to Denmark, crippled their economy, and undermined their ability to wage war. The disruption caused by the Anglo-Dutch victory had a profound impact on the balance of power in Europe. And we can't talk about boring battles without mentioning the Battle of In 1788, the Austrian army faced off against the Ottoman Empire in what should have been a routine border skirmish. But trust me, things went hilariously wrong. The confusion led to the unthinkable. The Austrians started shooting at themselves, mistaking their comrades for the enemy. Imagine the chaos of friendly fire before the Ottomans even showed up. Talk about a recipe for disaster. And here's where the story takes a turn. The Ottomans hadn't intended to engage in battle that day. They were actually on their way back from an earlier skirmish where they had fought against the Russians. But wouldn't you know it, the returning Ottomans stumbled upon the confused Austrians in full-blown friendly fire mode. Seizing the opportunity, they took action. With the confusion still at its peak, the Ottomans charged into what they thought was an enemy camp, attacking the helpless Austrians. Needless to say, this unorthodox battle didn't last long. The Ottomans won a decisive victory, inflicting heavy casualties on the Austrian forces, who were still trying to figure out why their own side was shooting at them. Now, you might be wondering, why was this disastrous battle significant? Well, get ready for a history lesson. This humiliating defeat for the Austrians had major consequences. It set the stage for the Ottoman Empire's resurgence in the region, marking the beginning of their temporary comeback as a major player in European politics. The battle also contributed to a shift in power dynamics that had echoes throughout the rest of Europe. But hold on, because we have even more fascinating examples to explore. The Battle of Caransebeș may have been a fiasco, but it wasn't as confusing as the Anglo-Zanzibar War of 1896. This conflict between Britain and Zanzibar, which lasted less than 45 minutes, holds a unique place in history as one of the shortest recorded wars. But don't let its brevity fool you. The Anglo-Zanzibar War had its roots in a struggle for control over the strategic port of Zanzibar. When the pro-British Sultan Hamad bin Muhammad his cousin Khalid bin Bargash seized power and invited a German warship to Zanzibar, much to the dismay of the British colonial authorities. In response to this perceived threat to British interests, a British naval squadron arrived off the coast of Zambia, demanding the restoration of the previous sultan and the eviction of the German warship. When these demands were refused, the British fleet opened fire on the city, targeting the royal palace and other strategic points. The ensuing bombardment lasted for only 38 minutes, making it one of the shortest wars in history. But why does such a short war deserve a spot on this list? The Anglo-Zanzibar War wasn't just about speed. It was a symbolic display of British naval supremacy at the height of the scramble for Africa. By swiftly and decisively crushing the resistance, Britain demonstrated its military might and established dominance over the region. The war also had lasting implications for Zanzibar and the wider political landscape of Africa. The removal of Khalid bin Bargash and the restoration of rule ushered in a period of increased British influence and control over the island, shaping its destiny as a British protectorate until the mid-20th century. Our final example brings us to the Battle of Karan. But wait, didn't we already talk about that one? Well, yes, we did. But this battle deserves a second spotlight because of the strange twist it took. You see, while the original Battle of Karan Sabas in 1788 was a confusing mess, the name was reused almost a century later for a completely different event. In 1887, the Austro-Hungarian army once again found itself facing off against the Ottoman Empire near Karansabes, but this time, things were a lot more straightforward. The real Battle of Karan Sabas was a tactical affair where the Austro-Hungarians sought to defend their positions against Ottoman advances. The outcome of the battle was far from decisive, and it is not considered a major turning point in the history of the region. So why are we talking about it again? The answer lies in the discrepancy between the two battles. Despite the lack of a significant historical event in 1887, the name Battle of Karan Sabas has stuck. This mismatch between the actual events and the historical record creates a fascinating historical puzzle. It raises questions about how historical events are named, remembered, and passed down through time. The continued use of the name Battle of Karan Sabas for the non-existent Battle of 1887 serves as a reminder of the fallibility of historical narratives and the importance of critical thinking when examining historical accounts. And with that ends our exploration of some of the most boring yet significant battles in history. Each of these encounters, from the Siege of Gibraltar to the Anglo-Zanzibar War and the mysterious Battle of Karan Sabas in 1887, offers a unique lens through which to view history. They remind us that greatness isn't always found in the most epic clashes, but can sometimes be hiding in the quiet corners of history books. So the next time you pick up a book or watch a documentary about historic battles, keep an eye out for those seemingly insignificant skirmishes. You never know when an unassuming battle might just surprise you with its hidden significance. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history's surprising twists and turns. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to stay tuned for more informative and entertaining content. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring the past. Have you ever read an account of a battle and thought to yourself, this is kind of boring, as you read about soldiers maneuvering for position, then locking into place and firing their guns until one side ran out of ammo? Do you find yourself wondering where the cavalry is, or the mystical shining armor, or even the giant space laser that shoots fireballs out of its butt? These stories of battles may lack excitement, but they may have been the key to unlocking entire histories. Battles like these may not feel epic, but they're what historians call a turning point, a moment where one side gained an advantage over the other. Turning points aren't always the smashing, clashing affairs we imagine them to be when we think of medieval knights, samurai sword fights, or the Battle of Har. Sometimes a battle won or lost in this way would go down in history as one of the most important events ever to occur, and we'd be none the wiser. So why is it that these battles seem so uneventful? Is it because they don't fit the mold of the dramatic, heroic battles we're used to hearing about? Or is there something more to these moments that history has deemed worthy of being called a battle? Maybe these boring battles reflect something deeper about human nature. Our brains love a good story, a narrative that builds and builds until it reaches some kind of exciting climax. The problem is that real life doesn't always follow this pattern. We want conflict to be something grand, decisive, and monumental. It makes us feel like the outcome of the conflict matters. After all, if battles were as simple as one side lining up against the other and firing until somebody ran away, there'd be no need to write down what happened in history books. Now, would there? Conflict in the real world isn't neat and tidy. Even when things appear to be going one side's way, there's always the possibility of an unforeseen event that will turn everything upside down. This means that our expectations and the reality of the world rarely meet up. What we want conflict to be and what it actually is can be two very different things. That's why we remember the dramatic clashes so well, because they're rare and exciting. When something fits our narrative of how conflict should play out, it feels special. But when it doesn't, like in the case of those quiet, uneventful battles, we may miss the significance of what is happening because it doesn't match up to our preconceived notions. But maybe, just maybe, it's in these moments of quiet conflict that we can learn something about ourselves. In a world where we're constantly bombarded with images of grand battles and epic showdowns, it's easy to forget that real life isn't always like that. It's in these quieter moments that we can start to understand the true meaning of the word battle. A battle isn't just a fight. It's a struggle to achieve something. It's a test of wills between two sides who each believe they're right. And sometimes the most important battles are the ones we don't even notice. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a battle to get back to. The year is 1914 and Europe is tense. The Austrians have just declared war on Serbia after the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne was assassinated in Sarajevo. As the Austrians prepare to march into Serbia, the Serbs dig in to defend their homeland. They're outnumbered and outgunned, but they're fighting for their country. It's going to be a tough battle, but the Serbs are ready to do what it takes to win. Then suddenly, the Russians come to the Serbs' aid. With the help of the Russians, the Serbs are able to hold off the Austrians. The battle ends in a stalemate and the Austrians are forced to retreat. This is a major victory for the Serbs. With the help of their new ally, they've been able to defend their country from a much larger and more powerful opponent. The Russians are eager to help their Slavic brothers in arms, but they're also hoping to take advantage of the situation to make some territorial gains of their own. They've got their sights set on the recently annexed territories of Austria, and they think this is the perfect opportunity to take them back. The Russians mobilize their forces and begin pushing into Austria. The Austrians are caught off guard and they're not able to mount an effective defense. Within weeks, the Russians have taken control of the situation and they're on the verge of a major victory. But then the Germans get involved. They declare war on the Russians and begin bombing them from the air. The Russians are forced to pull back and regroup. The battle ends in a stalemate and the Russians are forced to retreat. Now, let's fast forward a few years. The year is 1918 and the war is coming to an end. The Austrians, along with their German allies, are on the offensive. They're pushing hard to try to make one last stand before the war is over. The Serbs, along with their allies, are dug in and fighting back. It's a brutal battle, but the Serbs are starting to lose ground. Their supplies are low and their morale is sinking. Just when it looks like the Austrians are about to score a major victory, something strange happens. The Italians enter the fray. They've been neutral up until this point, but they're not interested in seeing the Austrians win. They join the fray and begin attacking the Austrians from the rear. The Austrians are caught off guard and they're not able to mount an effective defense. Within days, the Italians have pushed them back and the battle is over. The Serbs are victorious and they've managed to hold on to their country. These two battles may seem unremarkable, but they're actually major turning points in the war. In the first battle, the Serbs are able to hold off the Austrians, thanks to the help of the Russians. This buys them time to regroup and prepare to defend their country. In the second battle, the Italians enter the fray and help the Serbs defeat the Austrians. This victory allows the Serbs to keep their country intact and helps bring about the end of the war. Both battles are important, but neither of them would have been possible without the help of outside forces. In both cases, the help came from countries that had an interest in seeing the Serbs win. The Russians wanted to help their Slavic brothers in arms, and the Italians didn't want to see the Austrians win. In the first battle, the Russians' intervention helps the Serbs hold off the Austrians. In the second battle, the Italians' intervention helps the Serbs defeat the Austrians. Both battles are examples of how outside forces can have a major impact on the outcome of a conflict. They also show how sometimes the most important battles are the ones that seem the least likely to be important. And of course, both battles were pretty boring. But hey, who needs fireworks when you've got history? Well, I hope you enjoyed this episode of Why Does History Suck? If you did, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe. You can also check out our website for more historical tales. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time. Napoleon once said that history is a lie that everyone agrees upon. And what better way to prove his point than by discussing some of the most uneventful battles in history? Because despite what Hollywood would have you believe, not all conflicts are decided by a single, well-executed maneuver or the valiant charge of a small band of heroes. What's key to understand here is that just because a battle seems uneventful, doesn't mean it's irrelevant. I present to you the Battle of the Cowes, which took place in 1054 during the reign of Edward the Confessor in England. Let's talk about the Siege of Derry, which took place in 1689 during the Anglo-Welsh War, which occurred in 17th century Hungary, is a grim reminder of the unintended consequences of war. The battle was part of the longer conflict known as the Long Turkish War, a protracted struggle between the Ottoman Empire and a coalition of European powers. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and share it with your friends. And if you haven't already, subscribe for more entertaining historical insights. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and remember, history is full of surprises, even in its quietest moments. During this war, Karansabes was a strategically important fortress. That's why when the imperialist army led by General Piccolomini approached the city, the Ottoman forces stationed there prepared to defend it. However, what transpired was one of the strangest battles in military history. The Ottoman commander, believing his outnumbered troops incapable of winning a conventional battle, devised a unique strategy. He ordered his soldiers to dig tunnels under the fortress walls and secretly open the gates from within. As the imperialist army attacked, the Ottomans would emerge from the tunnels, opening the gates to allow the enemy to enter the city unopposed. It sounds unbelievable, but this bizarre plan was put into action. The result was utter confusion. As the imperialist troops entered the fortress through the open gates, they found themselves facing not just the Ottoman defenders, but also the elements of their own army who had emerged from the tunnels. The battle descended into a chaotic free-for-all, with troops fighting as much against their own comrades as against the enemy. In the end, the imperialist army was victorious, capturing the fortress and defeating the Ottomans. However, the victory was overshadowed by the heavy casualties suffered by both sides. The Battle of Karanseb serves as a stark reminder of the dangers of unconventional warfare. It demonstrates how desperation and a lack of resources can lead to unorthodox strategies. It also highlights the unintended consequences of war, showing how even a successful battle can lead to heavy losses. This siege occurred when the English, under the command of King James II, attempted to capture the fortified city of Derry in Ireland. Last but certainly not least, we come to the Siege of Gibraltar, a 7-year ordeal that lasted from 1779 to 1783 during the American Revolutionary War. The siege was part of a larger Spanish effort to recapture Gibraltar, a British overseas territory located at the southern tip of the Iberian Peninsula. Why did Spain want Gibraltar back? Well, firstly, it was a matter of national pride. Spain had controlled Gibraltar for centuries before Britain captured it in 1704 during the War of the Spanish Succession. Retaking the fortress was seen as a way to restore Spanish prestige. Secondly, controlling Gibraltar would enhance Spain's strategic position in the Mediterranean. At the time, the Mediterranean was a key region for naval power, and having control of Gibraltar would give Spain a significant advantage over their rivals, particularly the British. So, the Spanish began the siege, bombarding the fortress with artillery fire, hoping to force the British to surrender. However, what followed was one of the longest and most uneventful sieges in history. The British, under the leadership of General Elliot, successfully defended the fortress, repelling attacks and inflicting heavy casualties on the Spanish and their allies, the French. Throughout the siege, the defenders of Gibraltar faced numerous hardships, including food shortages and disease outbreaks, but they never wavered, demonstrating extraordinary courage and resilience. Eventually, the siege came to an end with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which officially concluded the American Revolutionary War. The treaty left Gibraltar firmly in British hands, ending Spain's hopes of retaking the territory. The Siege of Gibraltar stands as a testament to the tenacity of the human spirit. Despite the hardships they endured, the British defenders successfully protected their homeland and secured their position in world history. Why? Well, because the city's strategic location was crucial in the war. Derry was a stronghold of Protestant resistance against the efforts to re-establish Catholic rule in Ireland. However, what followed was one of the most peculiar sieges in history. Despite being heavily outnumbered and under constant attack, the defenders of Derry held out for a remarkable 105 days. You might be wondering why it's included in this list if it lasted so long. Well, it's because for all its duration, the siege was characterized by boredom. There were very few major engagements and the casualties were relatively low. For the defenders, this meant living under constant threat without much action. For the English, it meant watching their efforts to capture the city fail time and again. What made the siege so uneventful was the lack of progress on either side. Neither the English nor the Irish could achieve any significant breakthrough, leading to a stalemate that dragged on. Eventually, the English lifted the siege and moved on to other targets. The significance of the Siege of Derry lies in its role as a turning point in the Anglo-Irish War. Despite its uneventful nature, the siege highlighted the resilience of the Protestant community in Ireland and the determination of the English crown to assert control. It was a pivotal moment that shaped the trajectory of the war and, consequently, the history of Ireland. The boredom of the siege itself became a defining characteristic that set it apart from other conflicts and cemented its place in history. The immediate cause of this battle, you ask? Well, it started over a simple territorial dispute between two English villagers, each claiming the right to graze their cows on a particular piece of land. As disputes over grazing rights often do, this one escalated into a full-blown battle. Villagers armed themselves and took sides, leading to a violent clash over what seems like such a trivial matter today. The details of the battle are sketchy, but the outcome was a decisive victory for one village over the other. The repercussions of this seemingly insignificant skirmish, however, were more significant than one might initially assume. Firstly, the battle highlights the importance of land rights and how passionately people could fight to protect their way of life. At the time, access to common lands for grazing was crucial for the villagers' economic survival. Secondly, the Battle of the Cows reflects the decentralized nature of power in medieval England. Unlike a war between established armies, this was a battle where everyday people took up arms based on local rivalries and personal beliefs. The battle also had implications for the social order of the time, reminding us that medieval life wasn't just about knights and royalty. Ordinary people's actions could also shape the course of events. Ultimately, the Battle of the Cows serves as a reminder that history is filled with seemingly trivial events that can have far-reaching consequences. It is a testament to the complexity of history and the need to examine even the most mundane occurrences to truly understand the past. In fact, many of these battles played pivotal roles in shaping the outcome of wars and, ultimately, the structure of countries. These boring skirmishes were critical to weakening armies, shifting alliances, or even consolidating power. The aftermath of these battles often left their mark in ways that weren't immediately visible. Take, for instance, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice, an ancient Greek poem attributed to Homer. Now, before you start thinking I've lost the plot, let me clarify. This isn't a genuine historical event, but a satirical piece of literature that uses anthropomorphic animals to critique the follies of mankind. The poem depicts a war between frogs and mice, and while it may sound absurd, it was considered a significant work in ancient literature. The idea of frogs and mice going to war satirizes the senseless conflicts that arise among humans. It highlights how easily people can be manipulated into fighting destructive and pointless battles. In essence, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice, though not a real battle, symbolizes the absurdity of war itself. It has a commentary on how even the most trivial differences can escalate into chaos if allowed to by those in power. No, sometimes the most significant battles are those that seem boring beyond belief. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to look at 5 of the most boring battles ever fought. Viewer discretion is advised for this video, as some of the events described may be offensive or disturbing. We, the makers of this video, in no way support or condone the actions of the subjects featured. No. 5. The Battle of the Frogs and Mice. No. The Battle of the Cows. Now let us jump into a real historical event that is so bizarre it reads like something out of a Monty Python script. Number 3. The Siege of Daria. From comical cow battles to a siege that made history. No. 2. The Battle of Now let's discuss an event that's not just boring, but downright tragic. Number 1. The Siege of Gibraltar. And that's a wrap, folks. Thank you for joining us on this journey through history's most boring battles. The year is 1716. The location: the banks of the Timok River in modern-day Romania. The stage is set for the Battle of Karansabis, a clash between two titans, the mighty Austrian Empire and the formidable Ottoman forces. The stakes are high. The balance of power in Eastern Europe hangs in the balance. Joseph II seizes the moment and assembles a formidable force of 60,000 men. He sets his sights on Banat, a strategic region coveted by both empires. Ah yes, alcohol, the elixir of confusion and the bane of battle plans. Why? Because these soldiers are inebriated and reeking of the very taverns that townsfolk have just frequented. Led by the cunning Grand Vizier Baltashi Must, the Ottoman forces have come to engage the Austrians in the battle Joseph II has so confidently anticipated. But what they find is not an army ready for battle, but a camp in complete disarray. The sobering realization dawns on them the next morning. The enemy they faced that night was not the Ottoman army, but their own. The full extent of the disaster only becomes apparent as the smoke clears and the wounded are tended. All around them, they see our soldiers firing blindly into the darkness, desperately trying to fend off what they believe to be an overwhelming Ottoman assault. The Ottoman vizier, taken aback by what he sees, believes the Austrians to be in full retreat. Emperor Joseph II, chastened by the disaster, initiates a series of reforms aimed at preventing such tragedies in the future. Military procedures are scrutinized, ranks are reorganized, and a new emphasis is placed on training and communication. Despite these efforts, the shadow of Karansabis lingers, a constant reminder of the empire's vulnerability. The memory of the fallen is kept alive, with monuments and memorials erected across the empire to honor the dead. In the years following the battle, the Austrian army, though reformed, never quite regains its reputation for invincibility. The Battle of Karansabis remains a dark stain on its escutcheon, a testament to the night it shot itself in the foot. Unable to comprehend the scale of the disaster unfolding before him, he assumes the battle is won, but also as a reminder of the fallibility of even the greatest empires. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like and subscribe for more historical tales. Thanks for watching. It is a story that transcends the clash of arms, speaking to the universal themes of human error, the arrogance of power, and the haunting specter of those who fight and die for causes of their own making. Without firing a single shot, the Ottoman forces claim victory and the spoils of war. The stage is now set for a misunderstanding of Shakespearean proportions. The supposed spies are surrounded, their protestations of innocence drowned out by the clamor of battle cries. Before they know it, the men are pinned down and under fire. Panic spreads like wildfire through the ranks of the Austrian army. The night air is filled with the crackle of gunfire and the cacophony of shouts and screams. Soldiers who stumbled out of the tavern now find themselves in the midst of what they believe to be an Ottoman ambush. These soldiers, seeking to unwind after their day's march, stumble upon a tavern and decide to wet their whistles. But what starts as a simple night out soon transforms into an episode of mistaken identities. Thousands of lives are lost, not in the clash of armies, but in the confusion of a night of drunken revelry and mistaken identities. As the sun rises over the battlefield, revealing the true extent of the carnage, the surviving Austrian soldiers emerge from their shelters. What they find is nothing short of a massacre. Their camp is a scene of devastation, littered with the bodies of their comrades, victims of friendly fire. Among the dead and dying are many officers, including the infamous Prince Eugene of Savoy, who would later become a prominent figure in the war against the Ottomans. As his army marches into the region, the Ottoman governor, Grand Vizier Baltachi Mustafa Pasha is forced to retreat. Joseph II's victory seems assured. But as the sun rises over the battlefield, something extraordinary unfolds. Why? Because fate, it seems, has a wicked sense of humor. The Austrian troops, having driven the Ottomans back, decide to settle in for the night. They establish camps along the Timok River, a moment's respite before the grand confrontation that looms on the horizon. Little do they know that this moment of relaxation will transform into a comedy of errors, a farce that will have them fighting not against the Ottomans, but against each other, a clash not of armies, but of confusion, a battle not of wits, but of blunders. Our story begins with a long and storied history of the Austrian Empire, a behemoth of European politics. At the helm stands the ambitious and enigmatic Emperor Joseph II, a man who dreams of expanding his empire, his borders, and securing its place as the dominant power in Europe. His gaze is set on the Ottoman Empire, a fading giant whose vast territories stretch from Eastern Europe to the Middle East. The Ottomans have long been a thorn in the side of the Habsburg dynasty, and Joseph II sees their demise as inevitable. In 1716, the opportunity arises with the Great Turkish War raging in the Balkans. But here's the twist: the decisive engagement he anticipates, the battle that will etch his name in military history, never materializes. As darkness descends, a group of Austrian soldiers ventures into the nearby town of Sabes in search of entertainment and, more importantly, alcohol. You see, these soldiers, tipsy at best and downright drunk at worst, are returning to their camps when another group of Austrian soldiers mistakes them for Ottoman infiltrators. As the chaos reaches its crescendo, the real Ottoman army arrives on the scene, and thus, the Battle of Sabes, one of the most bizarre and comical episodes in military history, comes to a close. The news of the defeat spreads like wildfire through the Austrian ranks, causing shock and disbelief. Emperor Joseph II, upon hearing the news, is left dumbfounded. He had expected a glorious victory, a triumph that would solidify his legacy as a military leader. Instead, he is confronted with the grim reality of a catastrophic defeat, a defeat not on the field of battle but in the halls of his own making. As the dust settles on the Battle of Sabes, a somber mood falls over the remaining Austrian troops. The debacle has shaken them to their core, exposing the fragility of even the most meticulously crafted battle plans. The tragedy serves as a stark reminder that sometimes the greatest enemy is not the one you face, but the one you create. News of the defeat spreads like wildfire across Europe, becoming a source of amusement and derision among the continent's nobility. The Battle of Sabes, with its tale of drunken confusion and friendly fire, quickly transforms into a byword for military blunders. The humiliation is compounded when the Ottoman Empire, ever eager to capitalize on their rivals' misfortunes, uses the incident to bolster their own claims of military prowess. For years to come, the shadow of Sabes would loom over the Austrian Empire, a constant reminder of the night their army shot itself in the foot. As for the Grand Vizier Baltachi Mustafa Pasha, he is hailed as a military genius, a man who won a battle without firing a shot. His tactics that night, whatever they may have been, are studied and emulated, and his name is sung in Ottoman military camps for generations to come. The Battle of Sabes, however, would continue to be a mystery, a tale shrouded in confusion and speculation. Historians would debate the true cause of the disaster, with some emphasizing the role of alcohol and others pointing to the fallibility of military intelligence. But perhaps the most enduring lesson of Sabes is the reminder that, in the grand theater of war, as in life, sometimes the greatest battles are won not by those who deal the most destruction, but by those who make the fewest mistakes. In the aftermath of the battle, a wave of grief and introspection washes over the Austrian Empire. And so, the tale of the Battle of Sabes serves not only as a cautionary tale about the dangers of war. Now we want to hear from you. What do you think is the craziest battle story you've heard? Share your thoughts in the comments below. On September 6, 1683, at the foot of the Sabes, a small town in the Austro-Hungarian Empire today, something extraordinary happened. Within minutes, the entire Austrian army was in a state of full-scale panic, but an army that was disorganized, defeated, and entirely exhausted from fighting their own men. The battle that was supposed to take place, a legendary showdown between the Christian Habsburg monarchy and the Muslim Ottoman Empire, never occurred. The catalyst was the Ottomans' continued incursions into the Habsburg-controlled Hungarian territories. At first, it seemed like the Ottomans were trying to scout their position. At that moment, he found himself surrounded by a group of armed men. Trapped in the pandemonium, he struggled to figure out what was happening. They opened fire, only to realize moments later that they were shooting at their own comrades. The darkness concealed friend from foe, amplifying the fear and uncertainty. Some soldiers who had climbed into trees found themselves trapped without a way down. What the Austrians had mistaken for Ottoman gunners were their own men, and the artillery fire that shook the camp was their own cannons being fired by accident. The enemy they feared so much didn't exist. In fact, they had shot at and killed more of their own men than any Ottoman soldiers. They spent the night exposed to the elements, clinging to branches while bullets whizzed past them. The irrationality of the situation as the soldiers turned on one another is a testament to the overwhelming power of fear in driving human behavior. Despite suffering such a devastating loss, the Habsburg monarchy went on to play a significant role in shaping European history. Their ability to learn from their mistakes, adapt and persevere is a powerful lesson in the face of adversity. The Battle of Karanseb serves as a cautionary tale for those who wield military power. The implications were profound. Not only had the Habsburg army suffered a humiliating defeat, but they had been defeated by an enemy they hadn't even seen. The reputation of the once mighty Habsburg monarchy was tarnished, and the balance of power in Europe was shifted. It is a testament to the unpredictability of warfare and the importance of clear thinking in the face of danger. The battle also raises questions about the nature of courage and the difference between physical bravery and intellectual fortitude. In a situation where the enemy is unseen and the threat is ambiguous, it takes a different kind of courage to resist the pull of fear and maintain a clear mind. A reminder that strength is not just measured by the size of one's army. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest battles are won not on the battlefield, but in the minds of those who fight them, but by the quality of its leadership, the clarity of its strategy, and the discipline of its troops. And if you love our content, your support would mean the world to us. Thanks for watching. It is a chilling reminder of how quickly order can turn to chaos, and how easily reason can be abandoned in the face of panic. The latter arrived to find the former in a state of utter disarray. Faced with this unexpected turn of events, the Ottoman commander Murzafend Pasha made a strategic decision to capitalize on the chaos. Recognizing the disoriented state of the Habsburg forces, Murzafend chose not to engage in battle. The seeds of mistrust and confusion sown at the Battle of Karansabis had far-reaching consequences, shaping the political and military landscape of Europe for decades to come. Instead, he ordered his troops to occupy key positions around Karansabis, effectively sealing the fate of the town and forcing the remaining Habsburg soldiers to retreat. Its ranks decimated by a friendly fire, its officers either dead, wounded, or missing. This decision to avoid engaging with an enemy that was already defeated may seem counterintuitive, but it was actually a wise strategic choice. By avoiding further bloodshed, Murzafend Pasha minimized casualties on his side and allowed his troops to rest and regroup after their long journey. The Ottomans, sensing victory without firing a shot, took control of the area. Chaos had won the battle. The ground was littered with wounded and dying soldiers, some too injured to move, others left paralyzed by fear. It is a reminder that victory is as much a product of good decisions as it is of brute force. The battle also underscores the importance of clear communication in the military and the disastrous consequences that can arise from its absence. The failure of the Habsburg army to effectively communicate intelligence led to a breakdown in order and discipline, ultimately resulting in a humiliating defeat. Many of the wounded were too afraid to move from their hiding spots, believing that any movement would expose them to the enemy fire. The night stretched on, filled with the groans of the wounded and the distant sounds of the approaching Ottomans. Meanwhile, some soldiers scaled trees, seeking a vantage point above the chaos that is suspended among the leaves. They watched as the forest floor became a scene of confusion and carnage. Still, they were vulnerable, exposed to the gunfire from both sides. The Habsburgs had unintentionally created a maze of death, a deadly game of hide-and-seek that defied any logic. As he searched for answers, he noticed something horrifying. A soldier close to him raised his musket as if to take aim. Graf reacted instinctively, drawing his sword and lunging forward. He knocked the musket away, disarmed the soldier, and shouted for calm, but his efforts were in vain. The chaos was too intense. Men ran past him, heedless of his pleas, and the sound of gunfire echoed around them. Then reports of wounded soldiers trickled in, adding to the tension. With a wild look in his eyes, the captain fired his pistol at Graf, who narrowly escaped, taking cover behind a tree. As the shots rang out, many soldiers sought refuge in the trees, turning the forest into a makeshift fortress. Others dove into nearby bomb craters, hiding as best they could. The ground shook with the force of the artillery fire, making it treacherous for anyone caught in the open. Those who couldn't find cover frantically waved white cloths to signal their peaceful intent. Nobody knew what to do. Suddenly, around 4 p.m., when most of the soldiers were resting, rumors erupted, spreading like wildfire through the camp. The Ottomans had attacked. Panic seized the troops. They scrambled to their feet, grabbing their weapons and rushing to safety, trampling over each other in the process. The Austrians planned to strike first and decisively, aiming to breach Ottoman defenses along the river Tisa and advance towards Bel. However, these ambitious plans relied heavily on coordination and timing, elements that were about to fall apart due to a series of By the time the Ottomans arrived, the damage had already been done. The Austrian forces had inflicted enough casualties on themselves to render them completely unable to fight. In the end, there was no major confrontation, no brilliant tactics, no heroism. The only victor in this battle was chaos. Soldiers shot at each other, desperately scrambling to escape, clambering up trees, dropping down into bomb craters, seeking cover behind whatever they could find, or digging hasty defensive positions against an enemy that did not exist. The answer lies in the chaos of human error. The Austrian soldiers, who were meant to fight a battle of strategy and endurance, found themselves engaged in a conflict of confusion. No one could tell where the shots were coming from or who was firing. Some soldiers thought they were being ambushed by the Ottomans. Others believed their own commanders had betrayed them. In the ensuing frenzy, the confusion only deepened. Friendly fire became widespread and casualties mounted. When the Ottoman forces arrived in the area a few hours later, they were faced not with a fully prepared enemy. Now you might wonder, how could an army, seemingly capable of conquering the mighty Ottomans, be so utterly defeated without ever facing the enemy? The Battle of Karansabis began with the best of intentions. On August 14, 1683, the Imperial Habsburg monarch Leopold I declared war on the Ottoman Empire. As the Austrian army advanced, strange things started to happen. Soldiers began to report hearing gunshots near the village of Karansabis. Among the soldiers was a young officer named Ludwig Graf, who would later become famous for his role in the Battle of Karansabis. Amidst the turmoil, Graf spotted a captain who appeared equally confused. In the midst of the pandemonium, a group of soldiers stumbled upon a field fortification, mistaking it for an Ottoman outpost. As night fell, the forest grew even more menacing. But as the night wore on, the true nature of the disaster slowly revealed itself. As dawn broke, the extent of the disaster became clear. The once proud Habsburg army was in disarray. The story of the Battle of Karansabis highlights the fallibility of human judgment and the potential for even the most well-intentioned plans to go awry. Furthermore, the Battle of Karansabis exposes the psychological toll that fear and stress can take on individuals and the collective. However, the aftermath of the battle reveals another aspect of human nature, the remarkable capacity for resilience and recovery. The battle ended without any actual engagement between the Austrians and the Ottomans. With the battle effectively over, the Ottoman forces then set about securing their position and tending to the wounded. News of the incident quickly spread throughout Europe, causing shock and disbelief. In the years that followed, the Ottomans capitalized on the weakened state of the Habsburg army and made significant gains in the region. The story of the Battle of Karansabis serves as a potent reminder of the fragility of human systems and the devastating consequences of fear, confusion, and miscommunication. Despite its obscurity, the Battle of Karansabis stands as a significant event in military history, offering valuable lessons in strategy, psychology, and the importance of clear communication. If you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to leave us a like. Hello and welcome back to my channel. In the annals of military history, there are few accounts as peculiar as the so-called Battle of Karansabis. On November 17, 1788, near the village of Karansabis, Austria, a confused series of events unfolded that resulted in the effective obliteration of an entire Austrian army. It was a disaster so colossal, so wholly the result of avoidable blunders that it makes one question how such a catastrophe could have been allowed to occur. The Ottomans laid claim to several Austrian-held regions in Hungary, including Belgrade and the Banat de Severin. For the Austrians, these territories were critical, not only for strategic reasons, but also because they represented a crucial part of their kingdom. There were whispers of a massive Ottoman force amassing in the area, ready to crush the Austrians. The troops were exhausted from their long march and eager to rest. Soldiers rushed to their feet, grabbed their weapons, and raced to the designated assembly points. The camp was thrown into complete disarray. Upon receiving reports of the supposed Ottoman troop movements, he too believed an attack was imminent. Without attempting to verify the information, he ordered his men to arms. An eerie silence descended, broken only by the rustling of the wind through the trees. The soldiers along the riverbank grew uneasy. They had been prepared for a full frontal assault, not this unnerving quiet. In the midst of the commotion, Lorden found himself isolated in a small house near the river. The initial volley of shots had caused casualties. Soldiers who had been caught off guard or were trying to flee now lay wounded on the ground. Seeing their comrades fall and realizing the gravity of their mistake, many soldiers panicked. They dropped their weapons and ran in terror, seeking cover in the darkness. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, the true extent of the disaster became clear. As he surveyed the scene, the weight of his responsibility crashed down on him. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sobs of the wounded and the laments of those who had lost comrades and friends. Stretching before them was a scene of unspeakable carnage. Hundreds lay dead or dying along the riverbank, victims of friendly fire. Mortally wounded by friendly fire, he was carried back to the house where he had taken shelter, now a somber witness to the tragedy he had inadvertently caused. Calls for accountability and investigations into the events at Karansabis reached the highest levels of government. A commission was established to look into the disaster, tasked with determining responsibility and suggesting ways to prevent such a tragedy from ever repeating itself. It was also a lesson in leadership, accountability, and the importance of clear communication. The events of that night served as a stark reminder of the human cost of war, not just for those who fight on the front lines, but for those who lead them. The battle remains a dark chapter in military history, a cautionary tale of what can go wrong when leadership falters and communication breaks down. With the field marshal incapacitated command of the remaining troops fell to others. Soldiers who had survived the harrowing experience returned to find their comrades and friends dead or injured. The joy of homecoming was replaced by the somber duty of burying the fallen and caring for the wounded. Leaders who had survived the night, shaken but determined to make sense of the disaster. The ground was littered with discarded weapons, a testament to the suddenness and confusion of the attack. The sky, once a canopy of stars, was obscured by clouds, mirroring the darkness that had fallen over the Austrian army. The battle, if it could be called that, was over, but the true cost of the night would not be known until the morning light revealed the extent of the devastation. His hasty decision to believe the initial reports without verification had plunged his entire army into chaos. But amidst the horror, there were glimmers of humanity. Some soldiers, realizing the terrible mistake that had been made, laid down their weapons and attempted to help the wounded. Others, overcome with guilt, cradled the dying, offering them comfort in their final moments. The narrow strip of land along the river had become a scene of carnage. Corpses and wounded littered the ground, their uniforms offering little distinction between friend and foe. Others stood frozen, overwhelmed by the weight of their potential crime. Without proper communication channels established, fear and uncertainty spread like wildfire. Soldiers began firing wildly into the darkness, their bullets finding their marks in the darkness. Amidst the chaos and confusion, orders were given for the troops to prepare for battle. Soldiers who had prepared to defend their homeland against a foreign invader were now faced with the prospect of having attacked their own. The gravity of their actions sank in, bringing with it a profound sense of guilt and remorse. The celebratory mood that had pervaded the army prior to the attack evaporated, replaced by a heavy shroud of regret and sorrow. They realized that they had been fooled. There was no impending Ottoman attack. What they had mistaken for enemy troops were nothing more than peasants returning home after a day of labor in the fields. The horrifying realization hit them like a wave. They had been poised to attack fellow Austrians. Military precision was abandoned in favor of hastily assembling as many soldiers as possible along the riverbank. Little did they know that their troubles were just beginning. Friendships and camaraderie were severed in an instant. Trust, once the cornerstone of military unity, crumbled under the weight of fear and misinformation. The bonds that had held the army together were torn apart. That evening, as darkness fell over the camp, a small group of Austrian soldiers stationed near the river spotted some movement in the Ottoman camp across the water. Soon the entire Austrian army was in a state of frenzied preparation, each unit convinced that they would soon be facing a major Ottoman assault. Along the riverfront, the soldiers formed shaky battle lines. Fear and uncertainty were palpable as they waited for the rumored Ottoman charge. Unable to make out the details, they assumed they were witnessing a large-scale Ottoman deployment of forces. Believing that an attack was imminent, they sounded the alarm. These rumors, though likely exaggerated, created an atmosphere of fear and uncertainty within the ranks. The men became increasingly anxious about the size and strength of the enemy they were about to face. As such, neither side was willing to back down. The stage was set for war. Despite being called a battle, the engagement at Karansibs wasn't really a battle at all. Their forces quickly made gains, capturing Belgrade and advancing deep into Austrian territory. Faced with this unexpected incursion, the Austrian Emperor Joseph II was compelled to take action. He assembled a substantial army, nearly 35,000 strong, under the command of Field Marshal Lorden and Prince Coburg. Their mission was straightforward: stop the Ottoman advance and reclaim lost ground. There were no opposing forces, no clash of arms, no strategic maneuvers. Instead, what transpired was a series of tragic misunderstandings that led to hundreds of deaths and thousands of injuries. The build-up to this fiasco was rooted in the complex geopolitical realities of 18th century Europe. At the time, the Habsburg dynasty's Austrian branch ruled over a vast empire that stretched from Spain to Bohemia. Their reign, however, was a turbulent one, frequently challenged by rival European powers. The Ottoman Empire, which at the time controlled Hungary, posed a significant threat to Austrian interests. Tensions were high and the Austrians were preparing for a confrontation. The catalyst for the conflict was a simple territorial dispute. The outbreak of hostilities in 1788 saw the Ottomans launch a surprise attack. As the Austrian army marched toward Karansibis, rumors began to circulate among the troops. On November, the Austrian army arrived at their camp near. Within seconds, the entire camp was abuzz with activity. At the center of this maelstrom was Field Marshal Lorden, the overall commander of the Austrian forces. As the situation escalated, messengers arrived from neighboring camps relaying similar reports of impending attacks. As the minutes ticked by, tension mounted. Then, as abruptly as it began, the commotion in the Ottoman camp across the river ceased. Suddenly, a single gunshot shattered the silence. The soldiers jumped, startled by the unexpected sound. The moment was one of complete chaos and confusion. As the first volley of shots rang out, the reality of the situation began to dawn on those in the Austrian camp. But the damage was already done. the true horror of the situation began to unfold. Soldiers who had fired blindly into the darkness now turned their weapons on themselves and their fellow Austrians. With the realization of their error came a wave of despair. The night wore on, filled with the sounds of gunfire and anguished cries. Amidst the chaos, Field Marshal Lorden emerged from his house, horrified by the sounds of men killing men. As the night drew to a close, the shooting gradually subsided. By the first light of dawn, the grim reality of the situation became horrifyingly clear. Among the dead and wounded, there was Field Marshal Lorden. As news of the catastrophe spread, shockwaves rippled through the Austrian Empire. The aftermath of Karansebes was marked by a sense of disillusionment and a thirst for justice. The legacy of the Battle of Karansebes wasn't just one of loss and tragedy. The Battle of St. George's Hill might just be one of the most forgettable events in English Civil War history. And that's saying something. The battle, fought in 1643 between royalists and parliamentarians, is largely overlooked by history books, not because it was insignificant, but because it was a complete waste of time. Fought over a piece of land that no one cared about, the Battle of St. George's Hill had no strategic value. It wasn't a decisive moment in the larger war, nor did it have any lasting impact on the course of the conflict. And yet, it was a battle, and it was fought with the same fervor and intensity as any other. But what was the point? Did this fight change the fate of England? Was it truly necessary? Spoiler alert, no, not really. In fact, the battle's outcome didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. The hill that both sides fought over was barely significant. Yet, this minor skirmish played a role in the larger narrative of the English Civil War. To understand the why behind the Battle of St. George's Hill, we first need to step back and take a look at the bigger picture of the English Civil War itself. The war, which raged from 1642 to 1651, was a conflict between the monarchy royalists and parliamentarians. The central issue was whether the king or parliament should hold greater power. On one side, you had King Charles I, who believed in the divine right of kings and ruled with absolute power. On the other side, you had parliamentarians who were pushing for greater political influence and control. These opposing factions were locked in a brutal war for control of England. The fighting was fierce, and many battles were fought for seemingly strategic reasons: control of territories, strongholds and key cities. But then there was St. George's Hill, a piece of land in Surrey, no more than a small rise in the landscape, became the site of a bloody confrontation that had little real importance in the larger scope of the war. In the early months of 1643, tensions between the royalists and parliamentarians were high. Both sides were desperate to gain any advantage in the conflict. Control of land, even seemingly insignificant land, was critical. St. George's Hill, located near the town of Weybridge, became the site of a clash between the royalists and parliamentarians. In May of 1643, the royalists, led by Sir William Waller, aimed to secure a position near the town, while the parliamentarians, under the command of Sir William Fairfax, sought to prevent the royalists from establishing a foothold. The hill itself wasn't strategically important. It didn't offer a commanding view of the battlefield or a tactical advantage. There were no major fortifications on the hill, nor was it situated in a position to control important routes or trade paths. It was, quite frankly, a piece of land that both sides would have likely forgotten about, had it not been for the escalating tensions of the war. The two forces faced off over this relatively minor hill, but the battle itself was largely inconclusive. Neither side gained a significant advantage. There was no grand victory, no major shift in power. It was a skirmish, a small conflict in a much larger war. In fact, it's unclear even how many soldiers fought in the battle, as the figures are lost to history. Some reports suggest that the engagement involved only a few hundred men. It was less of a battle and more of a brief, intense confrontation that ended almost as quickly as it started. The aftermath of the Battle of St. George's Hill wasn't much better than the battle itself. Both sides suffered casualties, but the losses were minor when compared to other, more significant battles in the English Civil War. The royalists retreated from the hill, and the parliamentarians held their ground. But did it matter? No one gained anything substantial, and the hill remained largely unchanged in terms of its strategic value. What's more telling, however, is the utter lack of consequence. After the battle, the two armies continued to fight their war in other parts of the country, and the St. George's Hill conflict was quickly overshadowed by more important engagements. While many battles of the English Civil War marked turning points in the conflict, this one was barely a footnote. For the parliamentarians it was a small victory, but nothing to write home about. For the royalists it was an embarrassing retreat, over land that no one cared about. No one remembers the names of the soldiers who fought here, and no one remembers the generals who commanded them. The Battle of St. George's Hill exemplifies how war often involves fighting for things that don't seem to matter in the long run. In the case of St. George's Hill, the battle was fought over land that neither side would find useful for the remainder of the conflict. No significant resources were gained from the fight, and no major strategic advantage was secured. But in the heat of war, small pieces of land can become highly contentious. Both sides were locked in a zero-sum game, desperate for any advantage they could gain. The Battle of St. George's Hill is a reminder that sometimes battles are fought not for grand ideals or strategic importance, but for a fleeting sense of victory. It's easy to see how a minor hill could become the focal point of battle during a time of war. When tensions are high, every piece of land becomes precious. Every small victory feels like a step toward ultimate control. But when you look at the bigger picture, the Battle of St. George's Hill feels like a pointless conflict. The land wasn't of much value, and in the end, no one gained anything from the fight. What makes St. George's Hill such an interesting, boring battle is its ability to fade into the background of history. The English Civil War had many famous battles, including the Battle of Naseby, which was a pivotal turning point. But St. George's Hill is a footnote in the larger narrative of the war. The hill didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. It didn't change the course of the war, nor did it lead to any significant strategic advantage. In the long run, the battle was forgotten. It was overshadowed by other battles that had real consequences, where lives were lost, and the future of England hung in the balance. The English Civil War was full of major engagements that would determine the fate of the monarchy and Parliament. St. George's Hill, however, was nothing more than a brief distraction. So, what can we learn from the Battle of St. George's Hill? First, it serves as a reminder that not all battles in history are epic or grand. Some are small, insignificant, and, frankly, a waste of time. But even these seemingly pointless skirmishes can have some impact. In this case, the Battle of St. George's Hill helped further divide the royalists and parliamentarians, even if it didn't change the ultimate outcome of the war. Secondly, it's a reminder that war can sometimes be driven by small, inconsequential things. The English Civil War was filled with disputes over ideology, religion, and power. But sometimes the conflict boiled down to much simpler issues such as the desire for land or control over meaningless terrain. It's easy to overlook these small battles in the shadow of larger events, but they played their part in the larger drama of the war. Ultimately, the Battle of St. George's Hill wasn't one for the history books. It was a brief, insignificant event in the grand sweep of the English Civil War, but in its own way, it reflects the absurdity of conflict, where battles can be fought over land that has no real value, and where soldiers can give their lives for a cause that ultimately doesn't matter. You might be thinking, a battle between frogs and mice, is this some kind of fable or a bad joke? Well, yes and no. While it's not a literal battle between amphibians and rodents, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice has earned its place as one of the most absurd and boring battles in history, if you can call it that. This conflict wasn't fought by men on the battlefield with swords and shields, but instead was written into ancient mythology by the famous Greek poet Homer. It's a story from a lesser-known work of his called the Batrachomiama, or the Battle of the Frogs and Mice. The title itself says it all. A battle between frogs and mice, seemingly meaningless and full of whimsy, yet strangely compelling in its oddity. While we might not think of this battle as an actual historical event, it serves as a fascinating reflection on how the ancient Greeks viewed conflict, perhaps even a satirical commentary on the pointlessness of many wars. But how did frogs and mice become embroiled in a battle that would go down in literature? Let's take a deep dive into this strange tale. To understand the Battle of the Frogs and Mice, we first need to grasp the context of the story. Written in Homeric style, is a humorous and somewhat satirical epic poem that mocks the idea of grand warfare, instead of mighty armies with legendary heroes. The battle is fought between frogs and mice, two creatures of the natural world. The frogs live in a swamp, content and unassuming, when one day a group of mice comes onto their land. For no apparent reason other than the natural behavior of creatures in the wild, the frogs feel threatened and decide to fight for their home. The mice, eager to defend their new territory, retaliate. And so, the battle begins. The frogs are depicted as larger than life, with great bravado, while the mice, though small and seemingly weak, fight back with equal determination. But instead of a noble or dramatic struggle, the battle is essentially a drawn-out, absurd affair where neither side emerges victorious or particularly heroic. It is a pointless feud fought over nothing of value, serving only to waste energy and time for both parties involved. What makes this battle so interesting and boring at the same time is its complete lack of consequence. In real wars, the outcomes often determine the fate of nations, empires, or people. But here, in this mythical battle, the stakes are almost laughably low. The frogs are fighting to maintain their swamp, while the mice are simply trying to take over a piece of land. There's no grand purpose, no deep ideological belief, and no actual gain for either side. It's the epitome of a pointless conflict. Even more bizarre is the nature of the fight. The frogs, with their bloated bodies and waddling movements, are clearly outmatched in terms of agility and speed by the smaller, quicker mice. The mice, though smaller, seem to have a slight advantage due to their nimbleness, but neither side fights with any real skill or strategy. It's a chaotic, slapstick affair, filled with silly accidents and missteps. If there were a most boring battle in history competition, this one would definitely make the shortlist. The entire battle sequence is laced with humor and absurdity, turning a supposed war into a farce. The frogs, with their war cries, hop around trying to fight off the mice, but their attacks are clumsy and ineffective. On the other hand, the mice, though agile, aren't much more organized. Their attempts to outsmart the frogs often lead to mishaps and miscalculations. The battle drags on with no clear winner or loser, and soon enough, the frogs and mice reach an impasse. They realize, much too late, that the battle was fought over something trivial and meaningless, and so, the story ends not with a dramatic victory or defeat, but with both sides acknowledging that their conflict was, in the end, an absurd waste of time. The moral, a commentary on the absurdity of conflict. Now, you might be wondering why even include a tale about frogs and mice in the first place. The Battle of the Frogs and Mice may be a ridiculous story on the surface, but it carries a deeper meaning, especially within the context of Homeric literature. Homer, best known for his epic works like the Iliad and the Odyssey, was no stranger to grand, dramatic tales of heroism, sacrifice, and war. But in the Batrachomiama, he flips the script, using humor and absurdity to comment on the futility of many conflicts. The story mocks the human tendency to escalate trivial disputes into large-scale conflicts, a lesson that still resonates today. Wars are often fought over things that seem incredibly insignificant in hindsight, in power, resources, and sometimes even pride. The frogs and mice, despite their exaggerated importance to each other, are fighting over a piece of land that, in the grand scheme of things, holds no true value. Much like many real-world conflicts, the battle is fought over something ephemeral and inconsequential, only to result in destruction and loss. The Battle of the Frogs and Mice is also a commentary on how humans, or animals in the case of this myth, tend to glorify battles, even when they're utterly pointless. In this tale, both the frogs and mice go into battle thinking they're engaged in a fight for something essential. Yet by the end, both sides realize that their fight was nothing but a waste. The myth, therefore, provides a biting critique of warfare, showing how senseless and often fruitless these conflicts can be. One of the reasons this myth is often considered boring is because it lacks the elements of drama and suspense that typically define epic battles. When we think of grand battles in history, we imagine moments of intense heroism, strategy, and high stakes. The Battle of the Frogs and Mice, however, offers none of these things. There are no grand speeches, no legendary heroes, and no epic moments of victory or defeat. Instead, it's a long and repetitive struggle with no meaningful outcomes. The frogs and mice fight in circles, much like how humans sometimes fight for causes that aren't truly important or that end in stalemates. The battle feels like it could go on forever without any resolution, just like many real-life conflicts. Additionally, there's no real sense of closure. The battle ends not because one side wins, but because both sides tired of fighting. The futility of the conflict becomes painfully clear, as neither side truly benefits from the fight. This lack of resolution and meaning only adds to the boredom factor. When a battle doesn't lead to a definitive victory or change, it becomes just another drawn-out struggle that leaves everyone dissatisfied. Despite its lack of excitement, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice has left an enduring legacy. It remains one of the earliest examples of satire in literature, providing a humorous yet insightful critique of the futility of war. Over the centuries, the tale has been retold and referenced in various works, reinforcing its relevance as a lesson in how conflicts, no matter how big or small, are often fought for reasons that, in hindsight, seem absurd. This story also highlights the power of mythological storytelling to reflect societal values and offer commentary on human nature. The ancient Greeks, through Homer, used the story to examine the nature of conflict, how even the smallest feuds can escalate, consume energy, and lead to endless cycles of violence. It serves as a reminder that not all battles, whether real or imagined, have to be grand to have lasting consequences. In a way, the Battle of the Frogs and Mice is anything but boring. Though it might lack excitement on the surface, it's actually a brilliant piece of literature that forces us to question the absurdity of conflict and the pointlessness of fighting over things that don't matter. The Battle of Pavia 1525 may be remembered in history as one of the key events in the Italian Wars. But in reality, it was a battle that felt more like a game of chess than a grand clash of armies. This battle wasn't about sudden victories, heroic charges, or blood-pumping moments of suspense. Instead, it unfolded like a well-executed, methodical military operation, one where the outcome was determined by careful planning and predictable strategies, rather than brilliant improvisation or dramatic turns of fate. And, much to the dismay of historians hoping for an epic showdown, it's largely remembered as boring, despite its significant consequences. Before we dive into the battle itself, we need to understand the backdrop. The Italian Wars were a series of conflicts fought in Italy throughout the 15th and 16th centuries. They were primarily fought between powerful European states, including the Kingdom of France, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Spanish Empire, each vying for control over the various city-states that made up Italy. By 1525, Italy had become a battleground for the larger European powers, and the Battle of Pavia was a pivotal confrontation between the French army, led by King Francis I, and the Holy Roman Empire under Emperor Charles V. This battle, fought near the town of Pavia in northern Italy, is often hailed as a turning point in the Italian wars, but was the outcome of meticulous, almost predictable movements rather than the boldness of battlefield brilliance. While the battle had major political implications, the combat itself lacked the excitement that makes for a classic military victory in many ways. The Battle of Pavia could be likened to a high-stakes chess game between two skilled players. The French, under Francis I, had a formidable army that was deeply committed to asserting French dominance in Italy. The French relied heavily on their cavalry, particularly the gendarmerie, heavily armored knights that were meant to overwhelm the enemy with force. The French strategy was fairly straightforward. Use the power of their cavalry and light infantry to break through the enemy's lines and create chaos on the battlefield. On the other side, the Holy Roman Empire, under Emperor Charles V, had a well-disciplined, though somewhat less flashy, army that was focused on maintaining a defensive position. The imperial army was made up of well-trained infantry and artillery troops who understood the importance of disciplined lines and patient warfare. The imperial forces were focused on holding their ground and waiting for the right opportunity to strike, using their superior numbers and artillery to wear down the French. When the two armies met on February 24, 1525, it wasn't with the frantic, unpredictable violence we often see in epic battles. Instead, both sides approached the conflict with a methodical precision, making calculated moves across the battlefield. The French cavalry charged at the imperial lines, as expected, but the imperial forces held their ground and used their artillery to devastating effect. The French, relying too heavily on their cavalry, failed to adapt to the changing dynamics of the battle. The imperial infantry, well positioned behind defensive lines, absorbed the French cavalry charge and began to pick off the French forces one by one. The real boring aspect of the Battle of Pavia is that it didn't unfold in any dramatic fashion. There were no surprise tactics, no heroic last stands, and no great moments of military genius. Instead, it was a battle fought in the traditional sense, one where both sides followed a clear strategy, and one side simply proved to be better equipped and more disciplined. The French cavalry, despite their initial charge, were unable to break the imperial lines. Instead of the cavalry causing havoc on the enemy ranks, they found themselves trapped and surrounded. Meanwhile, the imperial infantry and artillery methodically whittled down the French forces. The battle turned into a slow grind, with the French struggling to make any headway while the imperial forces absorbed the blows and patiently retaliated. What made the battle so boring was the lack of flair or excitement. There were no sweeping charges or stunning victories, no major breakthroughs, no tactical surprises. The fight played out much like a game of chess, with one side making a move and the other responding in kind. The outcome felt almost inevitable. The imperial forces, under the command of Charles V's general, Antonio the Labor, simply held steady and gradually wore down the French. Despite the rather uneventful nature of the battle itself, the Battle of Pavia had significant consequences. The French army suffered a crushing defeat, and King Francis I was captured by the imperial forces. The loss of such an important leader was a blow to French ambitions in Italy, and it shifted the balance of power in the region. In the aftermath of the battle, the French were forced to sign the Treaty of Madrid in 1526, a humiliating peace agreement that saw them lose significant territories in Italy. The Holy Roman Empire, under Charles V, emerged as the dominant power in the region. The battle's consequences were far-reaching, leading to the eventual decline of French influence in Italy. However, despite the importance of the battle's aftermath, the battle itself wasn't a dramatic, world-changing event. There were no surprises or moments of glory. The French army, despite its initial promise, was defeated through a slow and methodical process of attrition. The imperial forces didn't achieve their victory through any extraordinary feat of military brilliance, but through the sheer weight of discipline and patience. And that's where the boredom comes in. The tactics were predictable, the execution was clinical, and the result, while monumental, wasn't exciting. The Battle of Pavia teaches an important lesson about the dangers of overconfidence and underestimating your opponent. The French, who had a reputation for their cavalry and aggressive strategies, failed to adapt when the battle didn't play out the way they expected. They charged in with the belief that their cavalry would overwhelm the imperial forces, but the imperial troops were prepared and waiting in the same way. The battle's methodical execution and lack of surprise can be seen as a cautionary tale about how war is not always about dramatic moments or bold actions. Sometimes, it's about patience, discipline, and waiting for the right moment to strike. This realization makes the battle feel boring because it wasn't a clash of titans, but rather the result of a careful strategy that slowly suffocated the opposition. Ultimately, the Battle of Pavia feels boring because it lacked the excitement that people often expect from historical battles. There were no heroic last-minute charges, no game-changing tactics, no clever maneuvers that shifted the course of the battle. Instead, the battle played out like a slow game of attrition, where one side was simply better prepared, more disciplined, and more patient. The French army's failure to adapt and the imperial forces' unremarkable strategy made the battle feel almost mechanical. But despite this, the battle's consequences were far from boring. The defeat of France at Pavia marked a significant turning point in the Italian wars, solidifying the power of the Holy Roman Empire in Italy. The fall of King Francis I and the subsequent Treaty of Madrid dramatically altered the political landscape of Europe. So while the Battle of Pavia may have felt like a boring chess game on the battlefield, its effects on history were far from dull. Sometimes, the most trivial conflicts can lead to unexpected results. Imagine, if you will, two groups of farmers fighting over cows. Yes, you heard that right. The Battle of the Cows may sound like a punchline to a bad joke, but it was, in fact, a real conflict that escalated into a full-scale battle in the 11th century. This battle may be one of the most bizarre and pointless conflicts in history, but its impact on the local community, albeit minimal, should not be overlooked. Fought in 1054, in the region of Brittany, modern-day France, the Battle of the Cows serves as an example of how seemingly insignificant disputes can escalate into something far larger than originally intended. It wasn't a fight over ideology, land, or political power. No, this was a simple dispute over grazing rights and, more specifically, over some cows. But while the actual battle may seem ridiculous, the deeper issue it highlights is the nature of rural disputes during medieval times. The Battle of the Cows is, in many ways, a window into the tensions that existed in rural communities, where even the smallest disputes could spiral out of control. The origins of the Battle of the Cows were quite simple. In the rural and agrarian society of medieval Brittany, land and grazing rights were essential to survival. Farmers relied heavily on their cattle, not just for milk and meat, but for plowing fields and maintaining the productivity of the land. The cows were their livelihood, and any dispute over them was taken very seriously. The dispute in question revolved around a group of Breton farmers who were engaged in a disagreement over the grazing rights for their cattle. One group, led by a local chieftain, claimed ownership of a specific piece of grazing land, which had been in use by his family for generations. However, another group of farmers, also from the area, began to let their cattle graze on the same land. When the first group demanded that the second group remove their cattle, the situation quickly escalated. Rather than resolving the issue peacefully or through local mediations, something that could have been done by the local lord or chieftain, the situation grew tense. Both sides became convinced that their rights to the land were being threatened, and this sparked anger and resentment. What began as a relatively minor dispute over land rights soon turned into a larger confrontation, with each side amassing more followers to their cause. At first, the farmers attempted to settle the matter with words, but when talks failed, tensions quickly flared, and the dispute transformed into an open confrontation. Small skirmishes broke out between the two factions, but neither side was willing to back down. The battle officially began when a group of farmers, angered by the continued grazing of their land, decided to confront the opposition directly. The battle itself, when it came, was far from the dramatic high-stakes conflicts of legend. It wasn't a full-fledged medieval siege or an epic clash between two armies. Instead, it was a chaotic, disorganized melee of angry farmers, wielding crude weapons, fighting to defend their grazing rights. There were no grand strategies, no legendary knights, and certainly no heroic charges. It was, simply put, a rural dispute that had gotten out of hand. What made this battle so comically unremarkable was the fact that it was, at its core, a fight over something as trivial as cows and land. It wasn't a grand military conflict between warring kingdoms or factions. It was a local scuffle over grazing rights, something that might have been resolved by a simple legal decision or a discussion among community leaders. The aftermath of the Battle of the Cows was as anticlimactic as the conflict itself. Neither side truly gained anything of value. After the brief confrontation, the two factions returned to their farms, nursing their bruises and cattle, but having achieved little. The cows didn't magically change ownership, nor did the disputed land offer any new opportunities. The community went on with its life, and the fight, though memorable to those involved, became just another small skirmish in a long history of rural disputes. The local lord, who had been somewhat ambivalent about the conflict, stepped in to mediate once the fighting had died down. He issued a decree stating that the land in question would remain open for grazing by both groups. The dispute over cows was resolved not with dramatic military victories or tactical brilliance, but with the simple enforcement of peace by a local ruler. In many ways, the battle's aftermath felt more like the resolution of a minor inconvenience than a decisive victory. In the end, the battle was entirely pointless. There were no great strategic gains, no shift in power, and no lasting consequences. Both sides ended up returning to their lives, much as they had before the conflict, and the cows, along with their grazing rights, remained largely unchanged. The local community likely laughed off the entire affair, as they realized how absurd the entire situation had been. No one became a hero, no land was won or lost, and the cows continued to graze in peace. The Battle of the Cows is one of those Events in history that begs the question, why even bother? There was no grand strategy involved, no epic tactics, no heroic charges, just a silly rural dispute that led to an equally trivial battle. What made this battle so boring was its complete lack of significance in the grand scheme of things, unlike major conflicts that shape empires, kingdoms, or entire nations. The Battle of the Cows wasn't a war for resources, power, or land on a grand scale. It was a fight between local farmers over a few acres of land and some cows. There were no high stakes or larger political consequences. The battle lacked the drama of major historical conflicts and the sense of urgency that typically accompanies warfare. Instead, it felt like a petty squabble between people who had nothing better to do than fight over something trivial. While the Battle of the Cows may seem like an absurd, boring event, it holds a valuable lesson about the futility of small conflicts and how even the most insignificant issues can escalate if they aren't handled carefully. In the case of the cows, what started as a minor dispute about grazing rights escalated into a battle. But, in the end, the result was inconsequential. The land remained the same, and both sides returned to their lives. The battle accomplished nothing, and yet it wasted time and energy that could have been used for more productive purposes. In a broader sense, the Battle of the Cows serves as a metaphor for how small disputes can snowball and lead to unnecessary conflict. Wars, even on a local scale, can often arise over petty disagreements, whether over land, resources, or pride. The Battle of the Cows reminds us that not every battle needs to be fought, and sometimes it's better to find peaceful solutions before the situation spirals out of control. Today, the Battle of the Cows is largely forgotten. It is a footnote in the history of medieval Brittany, and it didn't have any lasting impact on the broader political landscape of the time. Unlike the famous battles of the period, such as those fought during the Norman Conquest or the 100 Years' War, the Battle of the Cows left no significant mark on history. It didn't shift the balance of power, nor did it lead to major political or military changes. However, the battle's absurdity has made it memorable in its own way. It remains a curious episode in history, illustrating how trivial disputes can sometimes escalate into conflicts that waste resources, energy, and time. The Battle of the Cows may not have been significant, but it serves as a reminder of the ridiculousness of certain battles in human history and how, sometimes, wars are fought over things that don't matter at all. The Battle of Wakefield 1460 stands as one of the more underwhelming conflicts in the history of the Wars of the Roses, a pivotal moment in the power struggle between the Yorkists and Lancastrians. The battle was important for the broader trajectory of the war, but in terms of actual engagement, it lacked the grandiosity of some of history's most iconic battles. There were no heroic figures emerging at the last moment, no brilliant military maneuvers that turned the tide of the war. It was, for all intents and purposes, an unremarkable clash, one that, despite its consequences, was mostly forgotten due to the absence of drama on the battlefield. The Wars of the Roses was a series of civil wars, fought between two rival houses, with England's royal family, the House of Lancaster symbolized by a red rose and the House of York symbolized by a white rose. The core issue was the English throne itself, who had the legitimate right to rule. Both houses, descended from the same royal bloodline, believed they had the right to the throne, and as a result, England was torn apart in a bloody conflict that lasted decades. The Battle of Wakefield occurred in the winter of 1460, and its significance stems not from the ferocity of the fighting, but from the personal loss sustained by the Yorkists. The Yorkist leader, Richard, Duke of York, had been leading the Yorkist faction in their fight to claim the throne. By December 1460, Rich had successfully secured a number of victories and believed that his claim to the throne was finally within reach. Richard's forces were encamped near Wakefield, in northern England, preparing for a decisive moment in the war. The Lancastrians, under Queen Margaret of Anjou, the wife of Henry VI, the Lancastrian king, had regrouped after several defeats, and they were determined to stop the Yorkists from gaining further ground. Wakefield became the site of a confrontation that neither side could afford to lose. When the battle began, it wasn't the strategic masterpiece we've come to expect from military history. It wasn't a grand battle with waves of heroic charges or a brilliant turning of the tide. Instead, it was a slow, grinding engagement, marked by a lack of strategic surprise or bold tactics. Both armies fought for control of Wakefield, but the outcome wasn't particularly uncertain. The Yorkists, led by Richard, Duke of York, were positioned in a strong defensive position at Wakefield, but they were overconfident and failed to take into account the possibility of an attack from behind. The Lancastrians, meanwhile, were more united under Queen Margaret's leadership and managed to outmaneuver the Yorkist forces by flanking them. Richard, Duke of York, and his forces were caught off guard and overwhelmed by a surprise attack. Despite having the numbers and the fortifications, the Yorkists were unable to hold their ground. The Lancastrians broke through their defenses and killed Richard in the battle. This defeat marked a turning point in the War of the Roses, but it wasn't because of the epic nature of the battle. It was because of the political consequences that followed. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Wakefield was not one of great triumph, but one of political realignment. Richard, Duke of York, was killed in the battle, and his death was a blow to the Yorkist cause. However, his son, Edward IV, would go on to reclaim the throne for the Yorkists just a few years later. The Battle of Wakefield was an important loss for the Yorkists, but it didn't change the outcome of the war. The real consequence of Wakefield was that the battle pushed the Yorkist cause into a temporary disarray, leading to a further consolidation of power by the Lancastrians. Queen Margaret of Anjou, whose role in the war is often overshadowed by her male counterparts, was now in a stronger position, and she used her newfound influence to lead the Lancastrians to further victories despite these immediate ramifications. However, Wakefield's place in history remains underwhelming. The death of Richard, Duke of York, was significant, but it was hardly the heroic last stand or dramatic climax that we might expect from a battle of such importance. The battle was won, but there were no iconic moments, no turning of the tide, no dramatic surprises, just a slow and steady march towards the inevitable. What makes the Battle of Wakefield feel so boring and forgettable is the lack of dramatic elements that we often associate with famous historical conflicts. There were no bold charges, no acts of heroism, no stunning strategic moves. Richard, Duke of York, was simply overwhelmed by the Lancastrians, and the battle was decided largely by sheer numbers and basic military strategy. It was not a battle that will go down in history as a turning point because it lacked the spectacle of other battles such as Agincourt or Waterloo. Furthermore, the battle's outcome, Richard's death, was not the climactic moment that we might expect from such a pivotal conflict. Richard died, but his death did not end the war or even significantly alter the trajectory of the conflict in the long term. The Lancastrians, for all their victory, did not truly win the war. The ultimate outcome of the War of the Roses was determined in later battles, with the Yorkists eventually claiming the throne. This lack of immediate resolution or a dramatic shift in power makes the Battle of Wakefield feel like a minor event in the grand narrative of the Wars of the Roses. It's a battle that, while important, didn't have the punch of other more famous conflicts, and its significance is often overshadowed by the larger events that followed. While the Battle of Wakefield may not have been a particularly exciting or dramatic conflict, it did play a role in shaping the broader scope of the War of the Roses. The death of Richard, Duke of York, was a blow to the Yorkist cause, but it wasn't the end of their ambitions. In fact, it set the stage for a resurgence of Yorkist power under his son Edward IV, who would go on to eventually win the throne from the Lancastarians. In many ways, Wakefield highlights how even the most forgettable battles can play a role. In the grand scheme of things, the consequences of this relatively boring conflict had lasting effects on the political landscape of England, but the battle itself is often remembered as an unremarkable clash. It's a testament to the reality that history is not always made by the most dramatic or exciting moments. Sometimes, it's shaped by the smaller, quieter events that set the stage for larger movements. Ultimately, the Battle of Wakefield served as a reminder that not all pivotal moments in history are marked by dramatic victories or heroic battles. Sometimes battles are boring, slow, and even anticlimactic. They may not be remembered for their grandeur or excitement, but they can still have lasting consequences. The Wars of the Roses, after all, continued for many years after Wakefield, and the Yorkists ultimately triumphed despite the loss. The Battle of Wakefield, like many other boring battles in history, teaches us that sometimes history doesn't unfold in dramatic, sweeping moments. The outcome of wars is often shaped by a series of small, unremarkable events, and sometimes the greatest consequences arise from the most boring conflicts.